They always said a clumsy Omega would never survive a night alone in Blackpine Forest, but no one had ever met Emily Carter. The rain had been falling for hours, drumming across the crooked wooden roof of the tiny cottage tucked deep inside Blackpine Forest, where the towering evergreens whispered old secrets every time the wind pushed through their branches. Emily Carter hurried across her uneven kitchen floor with a steaming kettle in her hands, only to catch the toe of her worn boot on a loose floorboard. She stumbled with a startled gasp, somehow saving the kettle while knocking a wooden spoon, a basket of herbs, and an empty bucket onto the floor in a noisy chain of accidents that would have embarrassed anyone else. Emily simply sighed, brushed a damp strand of chestnut hair behind her ear, and laughed quietly at herself. The wolves in the nearby packs called her hopeless. The elders called her too gentle for a world ruled by strength. Even children giggled whenever she tripped over tree roots during festivals. Yet every injured bird, every abandoned fawn, and every frightened stray somehow found its way to her little cottage, as though kindness carried its own scent through the forest. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Emily wrapped an old wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch, worried about the storm. She always checked the woods after heavy rain because frightened animals often wandered onto the narrow trail beside her home. The air smelled of soaked pine needles, fresh earth, and cold stone. Lightning flashed for only a heartbeat, but it was enough for her to notice something enormous lying beside the creek nearly 40 yards away. Her heart skipped. At first she thought a fallen tree blocked the bank. Then the shape moved. She swallowed hard. It was a wolf. No, not simply a wolf. It was the largest black wolf she had ever imagined, its thick midnight fur glistening beneath the rain, its broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, exhausted breaths. Even from a distance, it seemed powerful enough to frighten an entire pack. Every story she had ever heard warned her to run. Giant black wolves belonged to forgotten legends. They were symbols of ancient rulers, impossible strength, and mysteries better left untouched. Emily took one cautious step backward. The wolf slowly lifted its head. Silver eyes met hers across the rain. She expected a growl. She expected the creature to disappear into the darkness. Instead, it simply watched her, strangely calm, as though it had been waiting for someone. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "You look like you've had a terrible night," she whispered, her voice almost lost beneath the storm. The wolf lowered its head again, too weary to stand. Emily glanced toward the distant trail leading back to the nearest village. No one would come until morning. Even if she begged for help, the villagers would probably drive the animal away with torches rather than offer mercy. She looked back at the silent creature lying in the mud. Its breathing remained steady but painfully slow. Her grandmother's words drifted into her memory. True hearts reveal themselves when fear asks them to walk away. Emily closed her eyes for one nervous breath, then tightened her shawl and stepped into the rain. She slipped twice crossing the muddy bank, nearly dropped the old blanket she had grabbed from her porch, and muttered another apology to no one in particular before finally kneeling beside the giant wolf. Up close, it was even more astonishing. Its fur was soft beneath layers of rainwater and leaves, its paws larger than dinner plates, and a faint warmth still radiated through its body despite the cold night. The wolf opened one silver eye and studied the awkward young Omega who could barely keep her balance. Emily offered the smallest, gentlest smile. "Let's get you somewhere warm," she whispered, never realizing the ancient king hidden behind those watchful eyes had already decided he would trust no one else. Emily had never understood why frightened creatures stopped trembling whenever she spoke to them, but as the giant black wolf rested its heavy head against the damp blanket, she felt the same quiet stillness settle over the storm. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice soft enough to blend with the rain. "I know you are tired. We are going home." The words sounded almost ridiculous the moment they left her lips. The enormous animal probably weighed more than 400 pounds. There was no possible way she could move it alone. Even so, she looked around the creek until she found an old wooden sled she used every winter to carry firewood. The wheels had broken months ago, but the smooth runner still worked well enough across wet grass and soft earth. She pulled it beside the wolf, slipped twice in the mud, laughed nervously at herself again, and finally managed to spread the blanket across the rough boards. "I am going to need your help," she admitted. To her complete surprise, the wolf slowly pushed itself onto its front legs. Its movements were deliberate but careful, as though it understood every word she said. With visible effort, it climbed onto the sled without a single growl. Emily blinked in disbelief. "Well, thank you," she murmured, almost smiling. She wrapped the blanket around its broad shoulders before leaning her weight against the rope. Every step toward the cottage felt like dragging a fallen oak tree uphill. Rain soaked through her dress. Her boots slid across the slippery ground. More than once she nearly lost her footing completely, only to hear a low breath from behind her that sounded strangely patient rather than irritated. By the time the cottage came into view, both of them were exhausted. Emily pushed the front door open with her shoulder and guided the sled beside the stone fireplace. She quickly added more logs, coaxing bright orange flames to life until warmth filled the little room. The scent of cedar smoke mixed with lavender hanging from the ceiling beams. The wolf quietly watched everything she did. Those remarkable silver eyes followed her from one side of the room to the other, never leaving her for long. Emily filled her largest iron pot with water and placed it above the fire. While it warmed, she gathered clean towels, soft cloths, dried chamomile, and a small jar of pine resin balm her grandmother had taught her to make years before. "You probably think I have no idea what I am doing," she said with an embarrassed smile. "That is fair. I trip over my own broom almost every morning." The corner of the wolf's mouth seemed to relax ever so slightly, almost as though the impossible creature understood humor. When the water had cooled enough to touch safely, Emily knelt beside the enormous animal with a wooden bowl. "This might feel strange," she warned gently. She dipped the cloth into the warm water and carefully wiped away layers of mud, pine needles, and rainwater from the thick black fur. Beneath the dirt, the coat shone like polished obsidian, impossibly soft beneath her fingertips. She worked slowly, speaking the entire time because silence always made nervous animals uneasy. She told the wolf about the robin that had stolen her gardening gloves last spring, about burning 3 loaves of bread in one afternoon, and about the old oak behind the cottage where squirrels somehow always found her hidden apples. More than once she accidentally splashed herself instead of the wolf, muttering quiet apologies that made the room feel unexpectedly peaceful. The great animal never pulled away. Instead, it lowered its massive head until it rested beside her knee, closing its eyes for the first time since she had found it by the creek. Emily smiled to herself, believing exhaustion had finally claimed her unusual guest. She never noticed the slow, thoughtful glance the wolf gave the tiny cottage, nor the silent realization forming behind those ancient silver eyes. For the first time in many years, the place that felt safest in the entire kingdom was not a royal fortress surrounded by guards. It was a humble wooden cottage where a clumsy Omega had welcomed a stranger without asking for anything in return. Emily woke before sunrise to the comforting crackle of the fireplace and the familiar scent of cedar drifting through the little cottage. Pale gray light slipped through the kitchen window, painting quiet patterns across the worn wooden floor. For one blissful moment she wondered if the remarkable visitor from the storm had only been a dream. Then she looked toward the hearth. The giant black wolf was still there, resting peacefully with its head lifted, watching her as though it had remained awake all night. "Good morning," she said softly, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You are still here." The wolf answered with a slow blink that somehow felt warmer than words. Emily smiled before hurrying to prepare breakfast. She stirred oatmeal over the fire, sliced fresh apples from the basket beside the window, and warmed a loaf of yesterday's bread that was slightly uneven because she had forgotten to turn the pan halfway through baking. She laughed quietly at the memory. "I hope you are not too picky," she said while pouring fresh water into a wide wooden bowl. "I have never hosted someone quite as impressive as you." The wolf calmly accepted the bowl, drinking with surprising patience before settling back near the fire. Outside, the forest had become unusually still. Birds that usually greeted dawn with cheerful songs seemed strangely quiet, as though the entire woodland held its breath. Miles away, that silence carried a very different meaning. Riders wearing dark cloaks crossed narrow mountain trails with determined urgency. Their horses moved tirelessly through the mist while silver wolf emblems gleamed upon polished leather armor. Every village they reached received the same careful question. Had anyone seen an enormous black wolf with silver eyes? The answer was always the same. No one had. Concern spread quietly through the northern territories. The Alpha King had vanished during a solitary journey through Blackpine Forest 2 nights earlier. Only his closest royal guard knew that their ruler sometimes traveled alone to escape endless ceremonies, disputes, and expectations. None of them had expected a violent storm powerful enough to scatter even experienced trackers. Captain Nathan Holloway studied the muddy ground where heavy paw prints disappeared beside a rushing creek. His expression remained calm, but worry settled heavily behind his steady blue eyes. "His trail continues," he said quietly. "He is alive." The men beside him exchanged relieved glances. None of them questioned how he knew. Wolves recognized one another in ways that words rarely explained. Back inside the cottage, Emily opened the front door to shake out a damp blanket. The cool morning breeze carried the fragrance of pine and wildflowers. She never noticed fresh hoofprints hidden beneath fallen leaves farther down the trail. Instead, her attention remained fixed on the wolf stretching comfortably beside the porch. Sunlight touched its midnight fur, revealing subtle silver strands woven beneath the black coat like moonlight trapped inside velvet. "You look much better already," she whispered with genuine relief. "Maybe another bath this afternoon, and you will be strong enough to go wherever you belong." The wolf slowly turned its head toward her. Those remarkable silver eyes lingered on the tiny cottage, the flower boxes beneath the windows, and finally on Emily herself. There was no sign that it wished to leave. It almost looked content. Emily tilted her head, puzzled. "Do not tell me you like this old place." She smiled and reached down to straighten the blanket across its shoulders. "There is nothing special here." The wolf gently lowered its head beside her hand without hesitation. Emily froze for a heartbeat before carefully scratching behind one large ear. The giant creature released the quietest satisfied breath, almost impossible to hear unless someone was standing beside it. Emily laughed so brightly that the sound echoed into the trees. Far beyond the forest, royal banners continued searching every road leading toward Blackpine. Yet the kingdom's most powerful ruler remained exactly where no one would ever think to look, choosing the peaceful company of a clumsy Omega, who still believed she was simply caring for a lost wolf that had somehow decided her humble cottage felt more like home than anywhere else in the world. By late afternoon, the little cottage no longer felt like the lonely place Emily Carter had called home for years. Somehow, without either of them noticing when it happened, every corner of the small cabin seemed to revolve around its unusual guest. Emily hummed softly while sweeping the floor, although she accidentally bumped the broom into a chair and sent a stack of folded towels sliding onto the floor. "I promise I am better at baking than cleaning," she said with an embarrassed smile. The giant black wolf watched her from beside the fireplace with calm silver eyes that seemed brighter than they had the day before. Its breathing had grown stronger. Its thick coat gleamed after another careful washing, and the stiffness in its movements had nearly disappeared. Emily felt relieved beyond words. She carried a basket into the forest to gather fresh herbs before sunset. Normally she walked alone, speaking to birds and squirrels as though they were neighbors. This time she noticed heavy footsteps behind her. She turned and found the enormous wolf following only a few feet away. "You really do not trust me to wander by myself, do you?" she asked playfully. The wolf simply continued walking beside her. Emily laughed, shaking her head. "Well, I suppose I have tripped into enough streams to earn that concern." As they wandered beneath the towering pines, something unusual happened. Rabbits that usually disappeared into thick brush remained peacefully nearby. A family of deer watched from a meadow without fear. Even restless crows settled quietly along the branches overhead. The forest itself seemed calmer in the wolf's presence, yet none of the smaller animals appeared frightened while Emily stood beside him. It was as though kindness and quiet authority had somehow found perfect balance. Emily knelt to gather chamomile blossoms growing beside an old fallen log. Before she could reach the last cluster, she lost her balance and nearly tipped forward. The wolf stepped beside her so quickly that his broad shoulder gently steadied her before she touched the ground. She blinked in surprise before smiling up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. "You may be the first creature in the forest who has learned how to keep me on my feet." The wolf lowered his head slightly, almost accepting the compliment. They returned home with baskets full of herbs, mushrooms, and fresh berries. As Emily prepared supper, she noticed something else that made her pause. The firewood stacked beside the porch had nearly doubled. She frowned thoughtfully. She had not gathered that much. Looking through the kitchen window, She spotted the wolf quietly carrying another thick log from the edge of the clearing before placing it neatly beside the others. Emily stared for several seconds. "That was you?" she asked in amazement. The wolf glanced back with an expression that somehow looked completely innocent. Emily could not help laughing. "You have been helping me all day." Instead of returning to the fireplace, the wolf settled beside the front door facing the forest trail. His ears remained alert while evening shadows stretched between the trees. Emily noticed that every unusual sound caused him to quietly lift his head before relaxing again when nothing approached the cottage. She folded another blanket across his shoulders. "You really are determined to guard this place, are not you?" she asked. Outside, the first stars appeared above Blackpine Forest while a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar through the open window. Far beyond the mountains, Captain Nathan Holloway studied a newly delivered map marked with fresh sightings of an enormous black wolf moving south. The search quietly narrowed toward Emily's forgotten corner of the forest. Back inside the cottage, however, the kingdom's missing ruler ignored every duty waiting beyond the trees. As Emily placed 2 bowls beside the fire and thanked her unusual companion for making the lonely evening feel less lonely, the great wolf rested his head near her chair, listening to the peaceful rhythm of her voice. Somewhere deep within his ancient heart, a truth he had never expected slowly took root. The humble cottage no longer felt like a temporary refuge from the storm. It had become the only place where silence felt warmer than any throne. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale golden sunlight, but an uneasy feeling settled over Blackpine Forest long before Emily Carter understood why. She stood outside the cottage hanging freshly washed blankets across a clothesline when the giant black wolf suddenly lifted his head. His silver eyes fixed on the winding trail disappearing between the towering pines. Every muscle beneath his dark coat became perfectly still. Emily noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" she asked quietly, following his gaze into the trees. At first she heard nothing except birds singing and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. Then came distant voices carried by the breeze. They were too far away to understand, but there was no mistaking that strangers were approaching. Emily felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. Visitors almost never came this deep into the forest. She glanced toward the wolf. "You should stay inside until I see who it is." Instead of retreating, the great wolf calmly stepped between Emily and the trail, placing himself a few feet ahead of her without making a sound. His posture was not threatening. It was protective. Moments later, 3 men dressed in traveling cloaks emerged from the trees leading 2 horses behind them. Their boots were dusty from long hours on the road, and each carried a walking staff decorated with carved hunting symbols. They stopped several yards from the cottage when they noticed the enormous black wolf standing near the porch. One of them let out a low whistle. "Now that is something you do not see every day," the oldest traveler remarked. Emily offered a polite smile, though her heartbeat quickened. "He is recovering from the storm," she explained. "He has not harmed anyone." Another traveler studied the wolf with narrowed eyes before looking back at Emily. "We have heard reports about a giant black wolf wandering these woods. Some villages believe it belongs to no ordinary pack." Emily gently folded her hands together. "All I know is that I found him injured near the creek after the rain." The youngest traveler tilted his head. "You are not afraid of him?" Emily looked toward the wolf, who remained perfectly calm beside her. "Not anymore," she answered honestly. "He has been kinder than many people I have met." The travelers exchanged thoughtful glances. Something about her answer seemed to surprise them. After a brief silence, the oldest man smiled warmly. Then perhaps he chose the right place to rest. They thanked Emily for her time, accepted directions toward the eastern trail, and continued deeper into the forest. She watched until they disappeared among the trees before releasing a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. "That was strange," she murmured. Turning toward the wolf, she noticed his attention remained fixed on the empty trail long after the visitors had vanished. His sharp senses seemed to follow sounds far beyond her own hearing. As afternoon settled over the forest, Emily decided to repair the old fence surrounding her vegetable garden. The task quickly became its usual comedy of small mistakes. She hammered one board backward, dropped half the nails into the grass, and accidentally tangled herself in a coil of rope. Each time she laughed at herself before trying again. To her surprise, the giant wolf quietly walked over, grasped one loose board between his teeth, and held it perfectly steady while she secured it into place. Emily blinked before laughing with genuine delight. "You really are helping me with everything now, are not you?" The wolf slowly blinked back, almost appearing pleased with himself. As evening painted the sky with shades of amber and violet, Emily prepared another simple meal and left the cottage door open to welcome the cool breeze. She did not know that the travelers she had met were not ordinary wanderers at all. Hidden beneath plain cloaks were trusted scouts serving Captain Nathan Holloway, and their quiet report was already racing toward the royal guard. They had finally found the missing king. Yet when the message reached the search party, it carried one detail none of them could explain. The mighty black wolf they had spent days searching for had shown no desire to leave. According to every witness, he had willingly chosen to remain beside a clumsy young Omega living alone in a forgotten cottage deep within Blackpine Forest. The next sunrise arrived beneath a sky washed in soft shades of gold and pale blue, but an invisible tension drifted through Blackpine Forest like morning mist. Emily Carter stepped outside carrying a basket of freshly picked herbs, smiling when she found the giant black wolf already waiting beside the porch. "You really do wake up earlier than I do," she teased. The wolf rose gracefully and walked beside her as though it had followed that same morning routine for years. Together they wandered toward the creek where everything had begun. Emily wanted fresh mint growing along the water's edge, and the wolf seemed content simply watching her hum quietly while gathering leaves. The peaceful silence lasted until a distant horn echoed across the valley. It was deep, noble, and unmistakably organized. Emily froze. The wolf's silver eyes narrowed toward the eastern ridge. A moment later another horn answered from farther away, followed by the rhythmic sound of several horses approaching through the forest. Emily's heartbeat quickened. "Someone is searching for something," she whispered. The wolf remained completely still. His ears turned toward every distant sound with perfect awareness. Within minutes, riders wearing dark cloaks appeared between the towering pines. Unlike the travelers from the previous day, these newcomers carried themselves with remarkable discipline. Their horses stopped almost simultaneously several yards from the cottage. At their center sat Captain Nathan Holloway, whose calm blue eyes immediately settled upon the enormous black wolf standing quietly beside Emily. For one long moment no one spoke. Then, without warning, every rider dismounted together. They lowered themselves onto one knee, their heads respectfully bowed toward the giant wolf. Emily stared in complete confusion. "What are they doing?" she whispered. Captain Holloway finally lifted his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said with quiet relief, "the kingdom has awaited your return." Emily looked from the captain to the wolf and back again. She blinked once, then twice. "Your Majesty," she repeated softly. The giant wolf slowly turned toward her. His silver eyes met hers with unmistakable gentleness. A warm breeze stirred through the clearing. Sunlight filtered between the branches, surrounding the great black wolf in shifting beams of morning light. Emily instinctively stepped backward, her basket slipping gently from her hands as mint leaves scattered across the grass. Before her eyes, soft silver light shimmered through the wolf's midnight coat. The powerful form gradually changed, not with fear or chaos, but with quiet dignity, as though dawn itself welcomed the transformation. Moments later, where the giant wolf had stood, a tall man now faced her. His dark hair rested neatly against his shoulders. His silver eyes were exactly the same eyes that had watched her beside the fireplace every evening. He wore a simple black cloak that one of the guards respectfully placed across his shoulders before bowing again. The forest fell completely silent. Emily could hardly breathe. "You," she whispered. "You were." The man smiled gently, his voice calm and warm. "Alexander Ashford." He paused before adding the words that made everything suddenly fit together. "Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Emily remembered every conversation she had shared while believing she was speaking to an injured animal. Every apology after dropping another bucket. Every story about burned bread and crooked fences. Heat rushed into her cheeks. I gave the Alpha King oatmeal in a wooden bowl," she murmured in disbelief. A quiet chuckle escaped Alexander before anyone else could speak. "It was the most peaceful breakfast I have enjoyed in many years." Several royal guards exchanged surprised glances. None of them had ever heard their king laugh so freely. Emily lowered her eyes, uncertain whether she should bow, apologize, or somehow disappear into the forest. Instead, Alexander stepped forward only one pace. His expression remained gentle, carrying none of the authority whispered about in countless stories. "Emily," he said softly. She looked up. "Thank you for seeing someone in need instead of someone to fear." The words settled quietly between them. Every tale she had ever heard described the Alpha King as distant and impossible to approach. Yet the man standing before her looked exactly like the loyal companion who had carried firewood, guarded her garden, and rested peacefully beside her little fireplace. Captain Holloway waited respectfully for his king to give the order everyone expected. The horses stood ready. The kingdom awaited its ruler. But Alexander did not move toward them. His silver eyes remained fixed upon the small wooden cottage that had become the first place in years where he had simply been allowed to exist without a crown. Emily Carter stood perfectly still as the quiet forest seemed to pause with her. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine through the clearing, gently lifting loose strands of her chestnut hair. Yet she barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on Alexander Ashford, the man she had known only as the gentle black wolf who had followed her through the woods, carried firewood to her porch, and rested beside her fireplace every evening. Nothing about him resembled the frightening stories whispered across the northern territories. He simply looked at her with the same calm silver eyes she had trusted from the very beginning. Captain Nathan Holloway slowly rose from one knee and took a respectful step forward. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the council has gathered at Crimson Keep. Every province awaits your return. Your absence has caused great concern throughout the kingdom." Several guards quietly nodded in agreement. Their horses stood ready, saddlebags packed for a journey that could begin within moments. Emily lowered her eyes, suddenly aware that she was standing between a king and his responsibilities. She forced a small smile despite the unexpected ache growing inside her chest. "You should go," she said softly. "Everyone has been worried about you." Alexander remained silent for several heartbeats. Instead of walking toward the waiting riders, he slowly turned his gaze toward the little wooden cottage nestled beneath the towering pines. His eyes lingered on the crooked chimney, the herb bundles hanging beneath the porch roof, the uneven flower boxes Emily had built herself, and finally the rocking chair where he had spent quiet evenings listening to her cheerful stories. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the clearing with calm certainty. "I am not leaving." Every royal guard looked up at once. Even Captain Holloway blinked in visible surprise. "Your Majesty?" he asked respectfully, believing he must have misunderstood. Alexander looked back at his captain without raising his voice. "I said I am not leaving." The words settled over the clearing with quiet authority. No one questioned them, yet no one could hide their astonishment. Emily stared at him in complete disbelief. "But you are the Alpha King." Alexander gave the smallest smile. "I was the Alpha King before the storm." He looked toward her again. "Here. I was simply someone you chose to help." Emily searched for the right words but found none. She had never imagined that such a powerful man could speak with so much gratitude. Captain Holloway stepped forward once more, choosing his words carefully. "Your Majesty, the kingdom needs your guidance." Alexander nodded once. "It does." His expression remained thoughtful. "And that kingdom has stood for generations. It can stand for one more day." A quiet murmur passed among the guards. None of them had ever seen their ruler postpone matters of state for personal reasons. Yet none of them could deny the peaceful change they witnessed before their eyes. The stern king they had served for years now stood beside a humble cottage wearing an expression they had never seen before. Contentment. Emily shook her head gently. "You should not stay because of me." Alexander answered almost immediately. "I am staying because this is the first place where no one expected anything from me." His silver eyes softened. "You never bowed. You never feared my title. You offered kindness before you knew my name." Emily felt warmth rise into her cheeks. She remembered every awkward conversation, every accidental spill, every bowl of oatmeal she had proudly served to the kingdom's ruler without realizing it. Somehow the memories no longer embarrassed her. They simply made her smile. Alexander glanced toward the cottage once more. "If you will allow it," he said gently, "I would like to remain here a little longer." Emily looked from the king to the waiting guards, then back to the quiet little home that suddenly felt smaller than ever beneath the weight of such an extraordinary request. After a thoughtful pause, she smiled with the same gentle kindness that had welcomed a wounded stranger only days before. "There is always room beside the fireplace," she answered. Around them, even the royal guards found themselves smiling. They had traveled across mountains expecting to escort a mighty king home. Instead, they had discovered that the strongest ruler in the northern territories had found something infinitely more precious inside a forgotten cottage built for one Clumsy Omega, who had never realized her greatest gift was simply making someone feel they belonged. That evening settled over Blackpine Forest with a quiet beauty Emily Carter had never truly noticed before. The sky glowed in soft shades of amber before fading into deep violet, while thousands of tiny stars slowly appeared above the towering pines. The royal guards respectfully established a small camp beyond the clearing, careful not to disturb the peaceful cottage their king had chosen over the grandeur of Crimson Keep. Emily carried 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea onto the porch and hesitated for a moment before offering one to Alexander. He accepted it with a grateful smile that still surprised her. "You do realize this is the first time I have ever shared tea with a king," she said with an awkward laugh. Alexander looked down at the simple clay mug warming his hands. "It is also the first time a king has been offered tea without anyone worrying whether it was served correctly." Emily smiled, then sat quietly beside him. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence felt comfortable, like the peaceful evenings they had shared before she knew who he really was. Captain Nathan Holloway watched from a respectful distance. One of the younger guards quietly stepped beside him. "I have never seen His Majesty like this," the young man admitted. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "Neither have I." His eyes remained on the porch where the king listened to Emily describe how she accidentally planted pumpkins where her herbs were supposed to grow, because she had confused the seed bags last spring. Alexander laughed softly, and the sound carried through the evening air. Several older guards exchanged amazed glances. They could not remember the last time laughter had echoed naturally from their ruler. Later that night, an elderly woman slowly approached the edge of the clearing with the help of a polished walking stick. Her silver hair reflected the moonlight, and her warm eyes immediately found Emily standing beside the flower garden. "Grandmother Evelyn," Emily exclaimed with delight, hurrying forward to embrace her. Evelyn smiled gently before looking toward Alexander. She offered a respectful bow, but the king quietly shook his head. "Please," he said kindly, "there is no need for formality here." Evelyn's wise eyes lingered on him before she turned back to Emily. "May we walk for a moment?" she asked. Together they followed the narrow garden path beneath the moonlit sky. After several quiet steps, Evelyn smiled knowingly. "Do you remember what I told you when you were little?" Emily tilted her head. "You said kindness never chooses the easy road." Evelyn nodded. "And you always wondered why the moon goddess gave you such a gentle heart in a world that admired strength." Emily looked down at her hands. "Sometimes I still wonder." Evelyn reached over and squeezed her granddaughter's fingers. "Because true strength was never meant to frighten people. It was meant to give them peace." Emily remained silent. "The moon goddess has a curious way of protecting precious things," Evelyn continued softly. "Sometimes she hides them where pride will never think to look." Emily frowned slightly. "I do not understand." Evelyn smiled toward the cottage where Alexander now stood alone beneath the porch light. "Many powerful wolves search only for greatness they can see. They overlook quiet hearts because they mistake gentleness for weakness." She looked lovingly at Emily. "But destiny has never shared that mistake." Emily slowly turned toward Alexander. At that very moment he happened to glance in her direction. Their eyes met across the moonlit garden, and for a brief instant the cool evening breeze carried the delicate fragrance of blooming jasmine between them. Alexander paused, almost as though he had sensed something long forgotten finally awakening. His silver eyes softened with quiet recognition, while Emily felt an unfamiliar warmth settle gently inside her heart. Neither of them understood exactly what had changed. There was no dramatic miracle, no dazzling display beneath the moon, only a quiet certainty that being together somehow felt as natural as the forest itself. Evelyn watched the moment with a peaceful smile. Some bonds she knew did not begin when two souls first met. They simply waited until fear stepped aside and kindness was finally allowed to lead them home. Morning sunlight poured through Blackpine Forest like liquid gold, touching every pine branch, every wildflower, and every weathered board of the little cottage that had quietly changed the course of a kingdom. Emily Carter stepped onto the porch carrying a basket of freshly baked bread, only to catch her boot on the same loose floorboard that had tripped her countless times before. She stumbled forward with a startled laugh, somehow saving the basket while dropping one loaf into the grass. Before she could bend down, Alexander Ashford calmly picked it up and brushed away a few blades of clover. "Still clumsy," Emily said with an embarrassed smile. Alexander handed the loaf back to her, his silver eyes filled with unmistakable warmth. "Thankfully," he replied. "Otherwise, I might never have met you." Emily laughed, shaking her head as they walked toward the garden together. Beyond the clearing, dozens of royal guards quietly prepared to escort their king home. Yet no one hurried him anymore. Captain Nathan Holloway had witnessed enough over the past 2 days to understand that something greater than royal schedules had unfolded inside the humble cottage. Before breakfast ended, messengers arrived carrying carefully sealed letters from every province. Alexander read each report with thoughtful attention before turning toward Nathan. "The council will convene tomorrow instead of today," he said. "There is one matter that must be settled first." Nathan bowed respectfully. "As you command, Your Majesty." Emily looked at him with concern. "I hope I have not delayed important work." Alexander smiled gently. "You reminded me what that work is truly for." Later that afternoon, riders, elders, merchants, and village leaders gathered in the forest clearing after receiving an unexpected royal summons. None of them understood why the Alpha King had called them to an ordinary cottage, hidden beneath towering pines instead of the grand halls of Crimson Keep. Curious whispers drifted through the crowd until Alexander stepped forward. He wore no jeweled crown, only the same dark cloak he had first wrapped around his shoulders outside Emily's home. Beside him stood Emily, nervously smoothing her simple dress while trying not to trip over the edge of the small wooden porch. Alexander looked across the gathering before speaking in the calm voice that carried effortlessly through the quiet forest. "Many believe greatness is measured by power, wealth, or titles." He paused, his silver eyes briefly meeting Emily's. "I believed that once as well." The crowd listened in complete silence. "A storm stripped away every symbol of my station. I was no longer a king. I was only a weary traveler in need of kindness." He gently reached for Emily's hand. "The first person who found me asked for nothing. She did not seek favor. She did not recognize a crown. She simply opened her door." Emily looked down shyly, her cheeks growing warm. Alexander continued, "If a kingdom forgets to honor hearts like hers, then it has forgotten what strength truly means." Murmurs of agreement quietly spread through the crowd. Several elders lowered their heads in thoughtful reflection. Others smiled warmly toward Emily, seeing her in an entirely different light for the first time. Alexander then announced his final decision. "This cottage will remain exactly where it stands." He looked around the clearing with quiet certainty. The new royal retreat will be built around it, not in place of it. No stone here will be removed. No garden will be disturbed. Let every future ruler remember that the strongest foundation any kingdom can have is simple kindness. The forest echoed with respectful applause. Emily blinked rapidly, overwhelmed by emotions she could barely understand. She looked toward the tiny porch where she had spent lonely evenings believing the world had overlooked her. Somehow that same porch now stood at the heart of a promise that would shape generations to come. As sunset painted the sky with soft shades of amber and rose, the gathering slowly dispersed. The guards returned to their horses. The messengers rode home carrying news that would soon reach every corner of the Northern Territories. Emily remained beside the porch watching golden leaves drift gently across the yard. She smiled as Alexander reached for a watering can, only for her to accidentally bump it with her elbow and send a splash of water across both of their boots. "I am so sorry," she exclaimed before laughing. Alexander looked down at the wet ground, then back at her bright smile. He laughed with her, not because of the spilled water, but because he finally understood something every crown had failed to teach him. Real strength had never lived inside castles or ceremonies. It had been waiting all along inside a quiet cottage where a clumsy Omega had welcomed a stranger with nothing more than an open heart. And that simple act of kindness became the place where a king finally found his home.